We'll be talking about skid roads. So here's the remains of one in the forest. The question partially is, well, why was I there fooling around with these skid roads? With the start of COVID and some of the lockdowns, I had to find a way to keep myself and my dog active, and we just started wandering in the North Shore Forest. After stumbling across different puzzling sites, we then just continued to follow them up, and that was in 2020. So 3 or 4 years later, here I am with having put together some of the stuff we've come across. I suspect you've all come across large stumps that are scattered both in the local forest, even in some of our local parks. What we'll be talking about, of course, is the story behind these stumps, the time period, why they were there. Most of these stumps still retain these notches in them. They were for springboards. As a kind of a setting the scene for paying attention to some of these details, a poem by Mary Oliver, which captures, what do you say, that everydayness can be what's really special about where we are. So as you can see, a short part of her poem was instructions for living a life, pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. Partially, I guess, that was my walk in the forest, and that's why I'm here. So this wandering evolved into a puzzle of how was the wood getting out of the forest? My dog Lishka and some field friends that supplied valuable technical assistance were part of the journey that we spent in the forest. So one example of wandering around and looking, we've even crossed the remains of a skid road between the two of us here. So what I'd like to go through first is showing the report area that I wandered in, showing some of the remaining old growth trees to kind of give us a feeling of what the forest was like, and then we'll start moving into some of the details of the logging back in this 1895-1915 period. And then moving into what are examples of this that are left in the forest of the skid roads, and then obviously for a context, some of the history of this Lynn Valley area in terms of the logging. So as you can see, it's the forest right above Lynn Valley, was the main area that I wandered in. And then on a Google Earth, we can see this red outline was the area that we'll be searching for what we can find. And as Julie mentioned, there were 2 prior talks that covered some of this same area. The Bob Muckle archaeology talk, he was looking for Japanese early logging-related settlements in the Seymour Valley. And then Lyd had her 1909 holiday, where in 1909 a set of young fellows went all the way up the Seymour Valley and then came back through the high country and even came down a bit into the Lynn Creek area. So my area consisted of 2 somewhat separated zones. One was the lower slopes of Mount Fromm, which is in here, which is the part that's more directly above the residential area, and then a mid-valley portion on either side of Lynn Creek that's kind of above the canyon part and as far up as Kennedy Creek. So let's look at a few of the trees that we came across while searching for these other logging artifacts. Some of this is to kind of capture the feel for what some of the forest might have looked like before the logging happened. These are obviously the old growth cedars. Here's a large fir high on a hillside. And one of the things to note on these cedars and why sometimes the stumps are so high, the base flares. And if you're trying to cut down a cedar with only your own muscle power, you don't want to be cutting way down at the bottom and going through twice as much wood if you can get higher up on the tree. Couple snags that again, to me, try to give a slight sense of what the earlier forest would have looked like. But of course, what is more easy to see, what is more in the forest now, are the stumps left behind. Here's one of the larger ones, and one of our part of the field crew has decided to pose on it to give a scale. And you can also see the numerous old notches. They've been probably fire burnt, so they're a bit bigger, but these would have held springboards. Now, what is it with all this springboards? I think a number of people have a pretty good idea. It turns out that fortunately, the North Vancouver Museum and Archives actually has one springboard in their collection. So it's obviously a long board, but the key item is the front of the board, the shoe, which is a metal plate with a lip. Because if you think about it a bit, if you're sticking the board into a small notch in a tree, you definitely don't want the board to come out when you try to stand on it. So this lip was the, what do you call it, the main basis that kept the board hooked into the tree. Obviously, the loggers still had the skill to make the correct shaped notch. The last part is standard practice is having spikes at the bottom of the logger's boot. Obviously, the wet West Coast, everything is slippery. So whether you're standing on a springboard or on the various parts of the underbrush, you don't want to be sliding off. Now, as you can see, sometimes you had to get fairly high up to get to where it made sense to cut the tree. You can see a kind of a ladder of notches, a low one, some middle notches, and the notches at the top. It turned out this was a convenient photo for kind of doing a thought experiment for imagining standing up here and then swinging an axe, pulling on a crosscut saw. So that's my attempt to give a sense of, you know, what the people were actually doing. And obviously, I felt there were a few gaps in the overall plan. And we won't go into the details, but in addition, the logger would be standing on a springboard here and somehow have to get up and onto the next springboard, which was certainly a challenge. In addition, a number of the stumps are on steep hillsides, so you had the opportunity to fall even farther if something went wrong. But at any rate, let's try to get more into the forest, see what we can do, finding bits and pieces of skid roads. And the good news is we've got a talented, experienced, and always enthusiastic leader that we can follow. So, skid roads, what are they? What do they find? Obviously, the fundamental reason for skid roads is to get the lumber, the wood, the fallen trees out of the forest. By a good coincidence, or Buzz Griffiths, I have a copy of his book in the back, did a graphic novel on logging in the 30s. And he had a section where he had a couple graphics of his memories of what skid road building in the 20s was like. So this is an example of kind of a major skid road that's being built, where they first level, grub out the ground, and then with the cut side planks, here they'll have a bottom board, a stringer, that they'll spike the side planks into, or the cross logs, to make that road. Then what it was used for, of course, is if you had a chain of logs, you're trying to get out of the forest down to the mill, that's what you would then skid down the skid road, hence the name. When it was logs, you could even kind of sometimes see a groove got formed in the middle of the skid road track. So this is about the one historic photo of skidding logs in our area that I've seen. But a lot of what was going on above Lynn Valley was not logging to get the timber out of the forest as logs, but instead to get shingle bolts out of the forest from the red cedar. So the other use of skid roads was for being able to pull sleds loaded with shingle bolts on them toward the mill, or in this case, to dump the shingle bolts into Rice Lake. Well, what can we find now about these skid roads? One example is you find the remains of a roadbed. The cross logs have presumably eroded and decomposed, and all that's left is a sense of the track, and sometimes when it's on a slope, you'll have a slight cut slope on the uphill side where they did a bit of digging to level out a roadbed. In this case, also what occurs sometimes is I believe the roots of the trees would grow into and under the cross logs, because if you're a root, you grow wherever you can. And then eventually as the cross logs rotted away, and in this case the surface eroded, you're left with these kind of fans of roots that come out, and that's sometimes a clue that you're also on a skid road. Better clues are when you can find the remnants of the actual cross logs. As you can see, it varies from being somewhat obvious to see and then covered by a jumble. Out a fair ways on a trail that goes to Kennedy Falls, it looks like they had used something that's closer to planks to make the skid road. And this slide is also an example of the passage of time where you have a whole tree that's grown on the road after the end of logging. But obviously, if you want to show people examples of skid roads, you can only show them stuff that they can see. More often, what you can find for skid roads are not, very obvious traces. So here's a case where you can come across a patch of cross logs still, somewhat visible on the forest floor. But also, sometimes you just run out of being able to see any part of the skid road. You follow them and then you hit a section that you may feel you're still on a track, or your feet feel like they're on a track, but there's nothing very much that you can see. So some of this means you've kind of got to look everywhere because you're never sure where anything's going to be. Some members of the field team were much keener at where they wanted to go, what they wanted to look. And most of us didn't always follow that particular member. So I'll give you just a short history on the Lynn Valley logging. And that's just to give a context of where the wood was coming out of the forest and why. And at the bottom you can see if the word flume is a new word to you, it's a way to take shingle bolts out of the forest. So our time period, pretty well 1895, 1911, or rounded off, 1915. The earliest logging, which you probably heard about, Moody's down in Moodyville, they were finished in about the 1880s. They got up into the central part of Lynn Valley, but didn't get up into the remaining forest that's in my report area. So the two key companies were Hastings and then Lynn Valley Lumber. Hastings was connected with the flumes, pretty well only shingle bolts, whereas Lynn Valley Lumber had two mills in the Lynn Valley area, both for logs and shingle bolts. So I'll spend a minute or two probably on this. This is an overview. Again, the red border is the area I've been wandering. And you can now see the two flumes that Hastings Logging had getting their shingle bolts down to Burrard Inlet. One came the west side of Lynn Creek, and the other came from Rice Lake, and they joined kind of in the middle of Lynn Valley. The other operation, which is more Lynn Valley Lumber, was more on Mount From, and they had two mills that their lumber went to. If you're good at visual memory, there's two kind of features that go through this area that show up that you may help you orient yourself. One is the hiking trail, the Baden-Powell Trail, that runs along the bottom of Mount From, and the other is the trail to Kennedy Falls, which is this magenta line that's on the west side of the Lynn Creek area. So in terms of the shingle bolts, one set of them started at Rice Lake, where the bolts coming from the forest are dumped into the lake, and then they would go down a flume all the way to Burrard Inlet. So this is obviously a historical photo of how the flumes were V-shaped and then would carry running water that would then let the triangular shingle bolt head down the flume. There's reports of young people in Lynn Valley occasionally for entertainment trying to hop in the flume and get a free ride partway down. There are also complaints about how clean was the water in the flume. This was also an early foot road from Lynn Valley down to Burrard Inlet. So at the end, as you can see, the bolts would just be dumped off the flume into the inlet. Again, this is all a Hastings company operation that would then go across the inlet to Hastings Mill on the other side. So, that's kind of the overview. Here's a little bit more of a close-up showing the two mills in Lynn Valley that, strangely enough, were called the upper mill and the lower mill. And it shows a bit better how one flume comes from Rice Lake, joins, and the other comes from up the Lynn Creek area and joins and then continues on. So there's our Baden-Powell Trail, and there's our trail to Kennedy Falls up at the top. And again, the red border is the area that we'll be wandering through. And there's a private road up to Grouse Mountain. Oh, and if at the bottom, we got about 4.5 kilometers and 6 kilometers north-south. One of the main, quite valuable sources of historical information was Walter Draycott, longtime Lynn Valley resident, kept notes, kept a diary, and then later published a couple versions of his early days in Lynn Valley. This is a sketch, current center of Lynn Valley, where the Lynn Valley Library is on the left, but this is some of the first kind of habitation in Lynn Valley, and I believe that's Mount Seymour in the background, so we're looking east, kind of across Lynn Valley. So here's an example of what the lower mill looked like, a standard lower mill. You'll notice indistinct here, there's this row of things or barrels on the top that show up better in the upper mill. Apparently this was the standard fire protection for mills. I never quite figured out, in terms of the water barrels here, whether the game plan was you somehow had a rope or something and could turn or tip the barrel over and flood the roof, or whether you just waited for the roof to burn through and the water then went down and tried to put out the fire. So, moving along, we'll look at obviously steam donkey engines, shingle bolts, bridges, and ramps. Now, I'm not sure how much people are familiar with donkey engines, steam donkey engines. They were the only mechanical power available in this time period. Everything else was animal power or human power. So in one sense, they were the going game if you had to yard something really heavy somewhere. Mills usually had a somewhat stationary donkey engine, and my question was, did these donkey engines get themselves up into this forested area I was looking at, to help assist the logging? So the donkey engine, I kind of feel, was a kind of a beautiful item of simplicity. It was a wood-fired boiler, and it only needed two things to run on, water and wood. So the wood would be underneath the boiler that would then create pressurized steam, that the power of that steam would then drive a piston back and forth, and that, of course, through gears, could turn drums. So what a donkey engine could do, you could get cables out into the woods that would hook onto the fallen bucked logs, and it could yard the log back toward the donkey engine, which was usually near a skid road, and then at that point, horses could pull it away on the skid road. And the second cable, called a haulback cable, they kind of in a sense made a loop, would be able to pull. Once the log came back in, they could then pull in the haulback cable, and that would bring the main cable back out into the woods to hook onto another log. The real beauty, though, or versatility of the donkey engines is they sat on wood feet, like runners, like sleds. So when the donkey engine wanted to go somewhere, instead of pulling a log to it, it would hook onto some anchor ahead and pull itself toward the anchor. And that's how they could move to different sites in the forest, and in this case, got into the forest in the first place. I like this photo that was dug up on the web. Here's a case of a donkey engine that moved itself 10 miles in the Yukon to get to a mine site. And again, just by having wood to run the boiler, they could then turn the wheels that pulled the cables in and out. So all I was really interested in was were there remnants in the forest that showed donkey engines were up there. So yes, there were some, not a lot, but we found bits of gears or cables. So on Mount Fromm, the squares and triangles are where we found pieces. So here's an example of a found gear, just lying in the forest. Here's an example of what I think are possibly the two different cables, the heavy main cable and a lighter haulback cable. On one stump, we found what I call a big staple. I am speculating that this was to drive into the stump to anchor the cable so that when the donkey engine is pulling with an incredible amount of force, the donkey engine itself would be held and the log would be what moved. And then on the side are log dogs that would be able to hook onto a log that could then be pulled. So similarly, on the west side of Lynn Creek, which is again, kind of in the direction of that cedar tree trail to Kennedy Falls, we've also found some scraps of equipment that I believe are related to donkey engines. Here, metal pieces, and there were about 5 different similar flat plates. I've never figured out, what part of the engine they were. They didn't quite seem to fit being part of the boiler. And I had the good luck to find this one cute little gear, somewhat by itself, just in the forest. So that's donkey engines. Now, shingle bolts were in a lot of ways the main product of the forest. Shingles was a big deal economically at the time. Major industrial mill, Hastings Mill on the Vancouver side, was shipping shingles all around North America. So this is some information about how they were made in the forest, and was I able to find any left behind. My understanding, and again this is from that graphic novel, is in the area of Lynn Valley, the majority of the shingle bolt cutting was done on contract by Japanese shingle bolt cutters. Here in Buzz Griffith's coastal world, it appears that the Chinese were the shingle bolt cutters back in the day. The shingle bolts had a standard length, so the tree that was fallen in the forest would be cut to those lengths, it'd be bucked to those lengths, and then by wedges and sledges and pry bars, because cedar conveniently as it splits somewhat reliably, they would split off the shingle bolts, which would usually turn out to be somewhat triangularly shaped. After that, when they were piled beside, they would then be loaded onto these sleds that we've seen a picture of on a skid road and hauled, in the case of the Lynn Creek, hauled to a flume. I tried to do some ballpark thumbnail measurements for how heavy these shingle bolts were, and I got numbers between like 70 pounds and 130 pounds. So just carting the bolts around was a lot of work. And of course, this photo implies the forest was reasonably tidy and kind of level. Well, that wasn't the case either. Things weren't easy doing some of that work. And there's that standard length that the bolts were. A historical photo shows the sleds that carried the bolts, and the system seemed to be to have a chain was the way to secure the bolts. I enjoyed the fact that, oh yeah, if I can spot it, not only do they have a dog in the picture, but there's also a young boy on a horse. A team of 2 horses would pull the sleds. So we did find a few bolts in the forest, left behind kind of randomly, but this is what you come across, kind of a pile, and you can sort of see the triangular side ends. The one kind of biggest pile actually showed up in a book in 1985. It's quite near a hiking trail in Lynn Headwaters Park. And that's what part of that bolt pile looks like today. So here's where I found the bolts. None were found on Mount Fromm, only in the Lynn Creek area. We did find some up at the far end by Kennedy Falls and along the hillside in a couple different places on either side. And that, of course, is the pile by Kennedy Falls. Again, you can kind of see the ends of the bolts. And some piles were, you just about had to walk into the pile before you realized there was one there. But this is a pile here that's obviously had debris fallen on it. A little pause here. I felt going along with Mary Oliver, which is, just pay attention. In the same way, if you leave your door and start paying attention, you're never quite sure where that's going to take you. In other words, if you see an item of interest and start following it, well, how far will it go? When will you finish with that topic? In my case, what it refers to is I started going out my door into this forest just to go out with the dog and see what I saw. Well, that turned into a 4-year project. And the dangerous part is sometimes it can physically be challenging, but it's also just dangerous for where your mind will go following a topic. But here's one example of going out your front door, where you're, we didn't know we were getting there on that day. We tried to find where was the highest places on the hillsides that still had been reached by the springboard logging. So a little bit now back to the skid roads. The best evidence is where they had to cross something, either rocky ground, and then I call it a ramp, or of course, if it's a drainage, we call it a bridge. This photo is here to show, again, 1915. They were able to build pretty impressive structures to get to where they wanted to go. Here's where they built a whole kind of trestle or suspended skid road across a rough part of a gully. This is just east on Mount Seymour to carry out these shingle bolts on the sleds. I feel this operation, that's an example of a major construction. What we find looking through the woods are the remains of fallen shorter ramps. You can kind of see the cross ties and 1 or 2 of the side stringers on either side. Here's an example where the ground is rough enough that instead of trying to dig and have the road on the ground, you just build a supported ramp, again with your cross logs. Another example of, you can see a kind of the rough enough country that we want to support the ramp. In general, I never found any spikes or significant notching for the cross logs. They seem to just lay them, in this case, on the side logs or on the ground. This was the one bridge that was still there, with heavy side stringers, cross logs, and the remains of some of the cross logs on top. And possibly an example of a larger bridge, again across a gully with its fallen cross logs. And here's where probably a smaller little ramp has then had the the forest debris washed away from it, and you can see the remains of it, and then the skid road covered by a forest floor continuing. But when you hit the larger creeks, you would sometimes just come to where the skid road ends. And you feel that, well, we've got a large creek, it must have been a large bridge. So surely it would be easier to find bridge remains the larger the creek was. Well, trust me, we looked, but we were unable to find anything. And so some of my conclusion is, ironically, the larger the creek, of course, the larger the floods and debris and torrents that come down the creek. So any evidence is more likely to be gone and washed away in a large creek than a small one. This would have been roughly where there was a bridge across this steep mountain gully. The edge of the skid road is about where that little red circle is. So besides finding bits and pieces, which was sort of a treasure hunt, the other puzzle part was, in terms of skid roads, is where were they going? What was the skid road pattern? There's an element that what I felt it was, I was trying to put together a jigsaw puzzle where I didn't know where the pieces were. I had to first find the pieces. I didn't know how many pieces there were, and I didn't know what the picture looked like. So it took a while of wandering repeatedly to find different little pieces. I'll give an example of that wandering on the Mount From area. So all of these little yellowy lines are GPS tracks of routes that myself and the field assistants that we wandered through, collecting whenever we came across something, the location of a bit and a piece of a skid road. From that, and I'll try to quickly go through these maps for people that are not map fans, we would then put down in a different mapping program that would put down the locations of all the different pieces we found, which are these colored sausages. The colors don't really mean anything, but it was a way of visually. So from that, one then started to get a feeling of, oh, well, what might have been the main routes? And then we can go back and give some more clearly defined coding to show what we think the main skid road routes and directions were. And then we eliminate all the clutter and are left with just the main coding here on Mount From, showing by the blue arrows how most of these skid roads had a route that took it all downhill toward the upper mill. And then when we put it on a Google Earth with those main routes, these white lines are the main skid roads coming off the Mount From mountain down to the upper mill. The Lynn Valley Lumber had one interesting method of shortcutting the shingle bolts to the mill, which was where the current Vantan club is, up on Mountain Highway, is a flat bench that's at the top of a cliff. And from that cliff, they built what they called a dry chute, about 2,000 feet long, that they could just drop the bolts down that went into a water pond, a splash pond, and that was their shortcut for the bolts that would then come down this way. Walter Draycott has a record of that dry chute, and unfortunately of one teamster that was killed when a shingle bolt, flew out of the chute just as he was crossing below the chute. All right, we're progressing along. We'll now look at some of the flumes, platforms, and some camps. There are two flumes in this area, Rice Lake and Upper Lynn Flume. So my other search topic was hunting for these flumes. And I, of course, felt these flumes were large constructions. And here's a model flume that was built relatively recently as an example. that's based on what the flumes were like at this time period. So standard construction, which we've seen some before, is the V-trough for the water and the shingle bolts. And then alongside the flume was like a walkway, because quite often the flumes were not accessed by a road. They were their only thing in the forest, and the access route was to walk along the flume, either to repair it or to get somewhere. So with all this lumber and cross bracing and a couple kilometers of flumes, these are the areas that I was looking for that were inside this still existing forest. I felt there's got to be some flume stuff left around, especially this flume on the west side of Lynn Creek. There's no other road or trail or other disturbance along this hillside. So even if you're not quite sure where the flume is, you would think wandering you would find some remains in the forest of all this cut lumber. The only specific piece of information about these flumes was this Draycott map, where he had hand-drawn in his recollection of where the flumes were. And the only limiting factor is his full map goes all the way to Burrard Inlet, and it clearly shows the flumes there. But his map kind of ends sort of where the current forest is and where I wanted to look. So he does show the flume coming from Rice Lake that went up, in a sense, up the creek before it could cross the creek and then come back down. And he shows the flumes starting up the west side of the Lynn Creek. But there's not a lot of detail in this area of the map, so there weren't that many exact features that gave a strong, definitive location of where it might be. So the short answer is, I never found one scrap of wood from the flume. My assumption is, hey, back in the day, cut lumber was valuable, and it was worth, when the flumes ceased their operation, to pack it out, whether it was free-for-all free lumber pack it out, or the logging company packed it out, or whether, forest fires have been through various parts of the area, so some could have been lost to that. But I did find enough to allow me to plot where I thought they were. So for the Rice Lake flume, I found all of 2 location points, one near Rice Lake and one where there's a historical record that kind of gives a specific confirmation of where the flume was. And from that, when we know kind of the slope of the flume, we can sort of work out its approximate location of where it had to be for that water to run downhill. So here was the one piece of evidence in the field, a trench where the construction of the flume had to cut through a little kind of ridge of high ground. The other flume, the Upper Lynn, had the same problem. We found only 2 pieces of evidence for where that flume location was. Before I show you the evidence, I found this was a good example, historical photo, of how a flume would look on a steep hillside. And again, you can see there's no road or anything nearby. I think where the walkway was, those boards are gone. But especially with shingle bolts that are short, the flume can be fairly curvy, and the bolts won't get hung up. But somehow they could build this flume working their way along the hillside. And similarly, here was the one piece of location evidence we found. Again, another spot where they had to cut through a little bit of a ridge to keep the slope of the flume that they wanted. So we've got this flume on the west hillside of Lynn Creek. And what, of course, the point of the flume is to get the shingle bolts down to it. Well, there was only one of the skid roads I found went all the way down to the flume. And that's this farthest skid road that started near Kennedy Falls, and then kind of angled, slowly descending across the Mount Fromm slopes. You can see this magenta line we've mentioned before is the current hiking trail to Kennedy Falls. In general, that hiking trail, it followed what were bits and pieces of skid roads, and then for the last part, it followed all along the historical skid road that started at Kennedy Falls. So that kind of leads to the question of, well, that got those shingle bolts to the flume. What about the other part of the hillside? This hillside over in here, how did they get their bolts down to the flume? And the problem was there was a steep hillside between the found skid roads and the flume below it, this kind of blue line with the black cross hatch marks. Because in my initial walking, and this black line is the cedar tree trail that's the main route in and out along that hillside, is just being able to find skid roads that's on the kind of upper side. I was unable to come across spotting any in this steep hillside area. And this is kind of the same area just shown on a satellite image, with the cedar tree trail being a bit more obvious here. And as this photo says, the hillside was steep, and of course that contributes to, even if there had been skid roads on it, there's much more movement of an erosion and coverage of what might have been possible. But finally, more from hunting and going up and down the slope to hunt for the flume, I came across 4 platforms on the slope. And that gave me an anchor that I could then hunt for maybe a skid road came down to the platform. So here's a picture of what I call connecting the dots. Here's that hiking trail, cedar tree trail, and what I knew were skid roads up here. But I then found 4 platforms just sitting in the hillside that then allowed me to trace back up from the platform the skid road remnants I could find that showed, well, here was the game plan. There was skid roads that dropped partway across the steep hillside to platforms. And this is an example of why you didn't always find very much on the steep hillside. You can see the field assistant, checking to make sure that none of the team was on the downhill side of that tree. But in the steep hillside, a lot of evidence with the passage of time, erosion, tree fall, had got obscured. So the platforms initially were at the just a flat spot at the end of a skid road. I still didn't know exactly what happened once you got to a platform, but here's what they looked like. This one is a sloping platform. In one place, it seemed they didn't need to build a wooden platform. They were able to make a flat enough area on the hillside where the skid roads ended. And another example of, in this case, platform 4, again, you can see, kind of the heavy supporting log and the, larger cross logs that created that platform. So I'd sort of solved half the question of getting down the steep hillside. The other half was, well, from the platform, how did the bolts go the last distance down to the flume below? The best idea I could come up with was, well, maybe they just kind of dropped them off the platform onto some sort of chute. We were fortunate that one platform, platform number 3, had some evidence below it that helped confirm that there was some construction that could have been a chute. So again, just before we look at platform 3, these are our 4 platforms, and the numbers were just in the order that I found them, because it's walk and stumble. And platform number 3 became the key platform because it had evidence below it. But again, you can see one route comes down and almost meets the flume, and the others had skid roads that came down to the platforms. So we'll take a look at platform 3 and chute 3. And chute 3 was to try to connect that last distance between the skid road that came down to the flume below it. So as you can see, platform number 3 was also kind of the largest looking of all the platforms. And then as you drop below the platform and look up, there's the line of the edge of the platform, and you can see some fallen timbers that my best guess is this was the start of kind of the ramp of the chute that went straight down the hill, down the fall line. And down that fall line, there were some cross logs that still had rods sticking up from them. And my interpretation of this is that the cross log was the anchor across the slope, and the surface of the ramp, the big ramp boards, these rods were driven through them as as to spike that ramp down to the cross log. So if we stand halfway down the slope and on the left look up, you can see some of the spikes in a cross log and a higher cross log and spikes, and we're looking up to where the platform would have been at the top. Then if we turn around, here's our spikes where we're standing, and that's the continuation of the chute going down, and then it drops off an even kind of steeper part of the slope to where the flume would be below. Later, after I did all this attempt at heavy thinking to puzzle out, could they have just pushed the bolts down a chute, I came up across a historic photo over in Mount Seymour showing what I believe is just that, where presumably there is a chute the other side of this sled, and they just push the bolts off onto the chute. And these bolts even look heftier than the bolts I was finding in the forest. So keep in mind, we're talking 100+ pounds being pushed down a mountainside. And then in the same area, there was one other historical photo that included a picture of the chute. And then on the left, if we zoom in, we can see the top part of what sure looks like a chute. The bolts would come down this flume, and this woods worker here with a peavey, presumably he would just lever the bolts out of the flume to fall onto the chute. Well, I'll just go back here for one last comment, and that is this whole system, getting the bolts down the skid road, onto the platform, and onto a chute, left one question unanswered, which was, how did they stop the bolts down at the flume? The usual game plan that makes sense to me and I've seen reference to is stuff coming down a flume would just fall off or down a chute, would fall off the end into a water splash pond, because obviously that's a great way to stop stuff without anything getting wrecked. Well, here, the flume was on the side of a hillside. There's no way they could have had a pond of water there. So I don't know, when these 100+ pound bolts flew down the chute, whether they invented some kind of wall that the bolt, smashed into and stopped it, or whether, in the case of the area I was in, somehow they maybe used some kind of sled that lowered the bolts down the chute. But anyone is interested to find a answer or information on that. One of the last topics to show, in going in and out along the Cedar Tree Trail, we came across the remains of what I call temporary logging camps. This historical photo, Spicer, 1895, is the best example I saw that captures, what a what a temporary camp wouldn't quite reach. You know, this is obviously a rustic early logging camp, and my guess is these temporary camps along the West Lynn hillside might have been somewhat like this, at the most one building, possibly a smaller buildings, and more hodgepodge. But this is an example of a, you know, kind of a working logging camp in the woods back in that time period, and again with shingle bolts on sleds. So where did we find the camps? Again, the main route in and out of this West Lynn hillside follows the current trail to Kennedy Falls. We found 4 spots that had remnants of camp artifacts. And of course, my feeling is if you're doing, you know, hard work every day in the woods, you didn't want to add a bunch of kilometers hiking in and out from a more permanent camp. You might overnight at these temporary camps. I don't know if they were only camps for the shingle bolt cutters or camps that any part of the logging crew could use. So here's what we found, Camp 1. This was the only camp that I felt had an identifiable area that was probably a building site. And as you can see, there were some vertical posts that I think were footings for a building that was on that. The main, what do you say it, advantage or leftover treasures that camps leave are parts of their stoves. So at each camp, we found parts of a cast iron stove. Camp 2 also had ceramics. You can see from the coloring on them that this is a similar style to some of the Japanese ceramics that Bob Muckle was finding in some of the sites he did work on in the Seymour Valley. And, you know, obviously the remains of a leather boot. Another aspect of the items found for the camps is they all seem to be of a similar style and vintage to each other, which is not absolute proof, but it suggests that these 4 camp areas were in fact related to the logging of that time period. Camp 3, again, here's the stove piece, and there were other bits of a stove and a couple bed rails right nearby in the forest, but no obvious spot where a building might have been. Camp 4, again, had its cast iron stove, and this camp had one place where previous hikers, you know, had spotted stuff, and as seems to be a common practice of explorers in the woods, if you find something, you pick it up and go put it with something else, and you slowly create a little pile. So let's take a quick review of the area we've been wandering in. So as we can see on the left is the Mount Fromm area with the white skid roads that came down to the upper mill, our Baden-Powell Trail running across. And now we can look up the Lynn Valley, the Lynn Creek area, and we can see the west side, the left side, the trail that goes all the way out to Kennedy Falls, and the flume along the bottom of the hillside. And we didn't wind up talking, but there's matching logging, the same Hastings company on the east side of Lynn Creek, and it had 2 major skid roads, one of which follows a bit a current hiking trail, somewhat similar to the way there's a hiking trail on the left side. So I, of course, would like to thank all the people that have been part of this. There's the field crew for, you know, what do you say it, moral support and expertise in finding stuff. And then 2 people and agencies that provided historical and archive information. A number of different staff at Minova, both digging out old photos and being quite responsive to my requests for more. And a lady that I've had the good fortune to meet, who did a thesis in 1998 that is one of the best compilations of the history of this time period in Lynn Valley. And then these last three people are folks that encouraged me in the topic to put all the stuff I'd been fussing with, to put it together, both as a presentation and maybe as a place to keep the write-up I've been working on. Obviously, there's one other vital part of this operation, and that, of course, is my family that had 4 years of living with skid road fanaticism. I even conned them into coming out a time or two into the woods. And as an example of how skid roads kind of crept into everywhere, it even got into our Christmas cards, where we, couldn't keep skid roads down. But of course, what the whole operation was about was being in the forest and the life that is in the forest, and that, of course, is, I don't know what's special about spending time there. There's other lives and worlds going on. And a lot of the forest reminds us not only of the life that's there today, but the past intertwined lives that have been there for a long time. As you can see, colonial settlement times, the communities that are here now, and the forest trees that have been here before those communities, and of course, how it's been the First Nations, part of their homelands, for time immemorial. So I think we've managed to reach the end of all the slides, and I can have a drink of water and stop. Whoa.
Hi. I'm wondering about the water in the flumes. How did they get it? You'd have to have quite a bit of water to keep them going and so forth. And could you talk about that?
I was going to say excellent, and I didn't even have to pay you for that, because I kind of forgot. So a couple of comments. But yes, like any number of things, you can have a great system, but if you're missing one part of it, it doesn't matter how good your system is. And the part we're talking about is, this water going down the flume, where did that come from? Because even from one of the pictures of dumping the flumes off into Burrard Inlet, it's like, we're talking more than a fire hose here. So one of my, categories of stuff I was looking for was, hey, let's see if we can find the intake structure or source. And unfortunately, like hunting for the flume lumber, we didn't find anything. My assumption on the West Lynn flume, that got close to Lynn Creek itself. The first hypothesis is they just continued had sort of a feeder flume that picked up water from Lynn Creek itself, and came into the flume at the point where the first shingle bolts arrived. And in that case, Lynn Creek would largely be a satisfactory source of water. For the Rice Lake flume, Rice Lake itself was the water source, but it's not a big watershed, and there's no significant stream or river coming into it. So my understanding there was, and there's a couple references to this, is they'd kind of wait till the lake was full and then go, okay, tomorrow we're going to send the bolts. And they'd almost kind of drain the lake, I don't know how long, but I suspect over a few days. And then quite late in my kind of one last look through the online archives, there's even a reference by Draycott, and he calls it the dog days of summer, when you were at low water levels everywhere. They would actually take the Rice Lake bolts, and instead of putting them into the flume, because they had no water, they would cart them by a tote road, I still assume on sleds, up quite a ways up the Lynn Creek to where they reached the Lynn Creek water, And then I think from his comment, they had a temporary kind of lower flume that they could then put them in using the Lynn Creek water. And maybe to finish, thanks. The first flume that started only in Lynn Valley itself used Hastings Creek for its water source.
I walk the Baden Powell a lot, and I see remnants of forest fires. Do you happen to know when the forest fires went through that area?
There's another aspect on Mount From. There was a mill by Grand Boulevard, and it built a plank road up into Mount From to put a portable mill up there. And why I'm saying all of that is they went through all that work and got their mill going, and then a forest fire completely burned everything out, and they went bankrupt, and that was 1912. But there's a series of references to different fires, 1910, and it's not always clear. It's moderately clear you had a fire. It's not always clear how much area the fire burned. But yes, in the Rice Lake area, when you say fire signs are even a bit more obvious.
I was wondering about why they wouldn't just like build the mill at the bottom of Lynn Creek and then put all their logs down in Lynn Creek.
A couple comments, but reasonable supposition. Because yes, an element I felt in doing all this wandering and winding up thinking about it is, especially if it's only your own muscle power and animal power, you're not interested in doing something the hard way. What's the easiest way to do anything, which a lot of times is, hey, let's build a flume, because we can build that, and building a skid road in this area would be even harder. So similarly, that they would look at the rivers and stuff. I believe in Lynn Creek, just down from the area I was looking at, which is also the start of the residential area, you get into that significant canyon and those jumping pools. So I think that's why, even though I believe it's some of Seymour River, they did put stuff down the river. So yeah.
I also did research on this topic, and I've always wondered about the horses and the fact they're walking on circular logs, and just wondering if you found any evidence that they injured themselves, because I feel like it wouldn't be very easy for them to grasp, to get a foothold when they're walking on circular road.
Happy to speculate. My sense of that, because yes, you can see historical pictures of different, places in Burnaby, pulling logs or sleds on these skid roads. So most of the historical photos, like I indicated, whether it's 6 feet or 8 feet or whatever, would have these larger cross logs that have being kind of logs, they look a little bit rounded, and then packed between them are smaller logs. So my sense is they didn't have something that their feet could break through. And I think that's the danger of broken legs. And possibly with use, the logs are no longer a slick item. They've been chewed up. And I think the grip is fairly reasonable. So yeah, I saw no complaints that indicated the horses were significantly unhappy about that.
You didn't find any horseshoes?
Well, no. I've seen a picture or two that I think they were shod. I've seen a picture or two that I thought was, oh, this looks like the heating stand that a farrier would use for, shaping the horseshoes.
And just one point was another thing I learned about where the skid roads needed grease to pull the sleds, and so so kids would often get excused from school, boys, to go out onto these skid roads, and they used grease that came from fish oil or something, and so that was like a job, and they would get paid for it.
Yeah.
And so they would grease it to keep the sleds moving.
Yeah, and that's right. I've seen some of the same references. Yeah, and it's more that, especially like Moody's, where they even had oxen dragging huge logs, the logs would make a little bit of a channel down the skid road. and that was the channel that they were greasing. Whereas my impression is the sleds for shingle bolts, and I was hoping to find tracks of the sled runners, but I never came across any tidy evidence of that.